Between Vertigo and Vertigo 2, I think there are a few lessons I've learned about VR. One is that simple interactions with items never seem to get old. I've played thousands of hours of VR games, and in that time you'd think little things like changing a weapon's firing mode with my hands would have lost some of its luster. But here I am in both Vertigo and Vertigo 2, and it's still immensely satisfying reloading a weapon, flipping the barrel up on a revolver, or even just opening a door. Another lesson, the back of your hand is just not a good place for a flashlight. Created by a handful of developers, the bulk of it made and scored by Zach Chilakis-Brown, the Vertigo series is a silly sci-fi adventure with a recognizable setup. Sonja, Vertigo's silent protagonist, is transported to another universe, ending up in the halls of Planck Interdimensional, a research corporation with little regard for workplace safety and a big problem with aliens appearing from other worlds. Colored by Half-Life, Portal, and even a little SCP creepiness, Sonja's fall down the rabbit hole is filled with guns, zany aliens, and a deadpan sense of humor. It's a convenient setting that allows for all sorts of ridiculous scenarios, but Vertigo has more than enough imagination to make it entertaining, funny, and at times unsettling. The original Vertigo released in 2016 and was replaced with the remastered version in 2020, which improved the visuals and overhauled gameplay. Vertigo 2, released in 2023, is not only a visual upgrade, but a more robust game altogether, with full-fledged cutscenes, more enemies, weapons, characters, and dialogue. Of the three, Remastered is my favorite. Like the other games, it has great combat, varied enemies and environments, and some delightful laughs. What sets Remastered apart is its near-perfect pacing and how it evolves the original version's gameplay. You can't purchase the original Vertigo today, at least not directly. It's included in Remastered as a beta. Due to what I assume are age and the headset it was built for, the first HTC Vive, the original version has some design hiccups that make playing today a little tricky. Locomotion is done either with the teleportation tool or by pressing the grip button. Being a fancy Valve Index user, I initially tried to play with the Knuckles controllers, but because the controllers don't have a grip button, it made moving a bit of a hassle. So I swapped my Index for my Quest 2, which immediately improved locomotion. It's an artifact from an era gone by. VR in 2016 was new and everyone was learning how to develop things, and I'm certain that headsets with different capabilities and controller layouts didn't make that initial learning curve any easier, not to mention the headsets that came out afterward. Aged as it may be, the original Vertigo is not only still playable, but also a lot of fun. It definitely feels as if it were made to be played with teleportation as the primary mode of movement. Projectiles are slow and relatively easy to dodge, and the first weapon you find, an electric baton, can block shots, but its secondary ability is an actual shield with a larger radius. Weapons recharge, so no reloading is needed, and the teleport tool can slow down time, an optional way to make combat a little easier that's only required during one fight. Vertigo's teleportation requires a little more work than what I'd consider a standard teleport mechanic. The teleporter opens a portal you pull open with your hand, almost like you're pulling yourself through a door. Remastered drops the slow-mo mechanic, but the teleporter is given a wormhole-like makeover, where you move a bubble over yourself to appear on the other side. It's a really neat design that makes the teleporter feel like an actual tool that manipulates space rather than just a locomotion mechanic. Presence strikes again. How Vertigo handles movement makes combat mostly a stationary experience. Most enemies don't move very fast, so you pick a spot, activate the shield in your offhand, and take shots with the other. Weapons are accurate enough that aiming down the sights isn't really needed, at least at close range. There's a fun detail where when you shoot security bots, they move their batons to the last place a round landed, forcing you to choose a different spot to shoot. Some enemies though, like these little hopper guys, hop around and make tricky targets, giving combat a certain level of duality. The hoppers rush you and make you move or flush you out of cover. You're forced to protect yourself both from threats distant as well as those that move up close. Vertigo and Vertigo Remastered both do a great job balancing the calm and chaos of Planck Interdimensional. Its narrow corridors and strange ambient sounds create an aura of mystery and otherworldliness. When the games open up with bigger environments, the scale only magnifies that mystery. What partially makes Vertigo, as a series, so fantastic is how often it changes up its context. About halfway through, you enter a big recreational dome, a place for Planck employees to relax in between their dystopian shifts. Tucked in a side room is the first iteration of Vertigo's rifle. It has iron sights as well as a mode for scoped fire. Scoped weapons are a thing I think a lot of VR games have had trouble with, but Vertigo's works really well. And of course, the moment you get it, you're given plenty of opportunity opportunities to practice your sniping skills. Picking up a key at the park's treehouse activates a stand your ground sequence. Robots attack you from the ground, and a giant boss drone fires rockets from the sky. It's a hectic and fun way to introduce a new weapon. Intentional or not, action in the original Vertigo is predicated on dual wielding. I imagine if you move mainly via teleportation, it's likely you'll carry a weapon in your other hand rather than constantly switching between it and the teleporter. And of course, in combat, blocking shots with a shield in one hand and firing back with a weapon in the other is the main way I fight. Remastered changes these dynamics. The teleporter returns, but there are more weapons and movement is bound to the analog sticks rather than the grip button, which obviously makes things like strafing and dodging easier and more intuitive. Stationary play is given less of an emphasis. Combat here is much more active and fluid, with enemies and weapons that are slightly more complex. The shotgun only has 3 shots before it needs to recharge, but you can also hold the trigger to power up one powerful shot. The rifle has automatic and semi-automatic firing modes, switched with the knob on the side. These small complexities give weapons a slightly deeper level of interactivity and make dual wielding a more practical tactic, as you can alternate the weapon you're firing while the other one recharges. Remastered adds drones that lob grenades and bigger robots with miniguns and shields, while boss fights are smoothed over and refined by virtue of the modernized design. The first boss, a giant terrifying anglerfish thing, is visually brilliant and well-made and fun. You have to smack away its tentacles and block the lasers it shoots at you. Remastered improves the fight by making the hitboxes in the monster's tentacles more precise, and by making the baton deflect shots rather than just block them. There is constant creative thought behind how Remastered's new enemies and weapons are introduced. The first time you encounter a grenade drone is right as you're crossing a wooden bridge. If a grenade hits the bridge, you're tossed into the pond and forced to swim to safety. The big shielded robot is introduced at the end of a gondola ride. The pod slowly creeps past it as it ominously watches in the distance and eventually knocks the pod from the rails. Right after you're given the grenade launcher, a catwalk leads you over a hangar with a group of patrolling robots, providing lots of targets for your new launcher. Remastered improves or enhances just about every element of Vertigo, and the effort to make Remastered grander and more vibrant is apparent and successful. Maybe my favorite boss fight across the entire series, Frank the Slime Monster, is just kind of stumbled upon in the original. Remastered builds tension before Frank's reveal. There's a creepy hallway and a broken container with a whiteboard detailing Frank and his goopy friend's biology, after which comes the encounter with his giant, immobile eyeball. The fight itself is brilliant. The floor may not be lava, but the slime hurts you all the same. You have to improvise your way across scattered debris while Frank attacks you with globs of high-velocity goop, tentacles with toothy mouths, and the occasional tidal wave. Cannons at the top of watchtowers damage Frank and reveal a brainy mass under the surface of his eye. After a few shots, Frank is reduced to a harmless blob with flailing arms. If you shake him around, he'll make silly squeak sounds, and you get the impression his outburst wasn't malicious. There's even an achievement for sticking him to one of Sonja's pockets and taking him with you till the end. The short playtime of Vertigo and Vertigo Remastered is not only appropriate, but allows the games to be perfectly paced. No fight goes on too long, and each set piece and boss fight is given just enough time to shine. Nothing overstays its welcome by a second. The upgrade tree, a new addition in Remastered, gives you a little more reason to poke around and explore Plank Interdimensional's disquieting corners. Among the upgrades are movement speed, teleportation range, and weapon damage, mostly standard stuff. These upgrades are more obligatory than creative, which is disappointing. Being able to move faster makes the game better, and upgrading that as you go is more relieving than it is exciting. Luckily, your upgrades carry over into a second playthrough, which means Remastered's great dodging and strafing combat starts much earlier, and it's that version I had the most fun with. Fast-moving, dual-wielding combat interspaced with slower sections of corridors and ambience. The back half of Remastered, once you've collected some weapons and upgrades, is damn near a perfect 2.5 hours of VR action. As I went into Vertigo 2, I was excited to see how Remastered, a great and logical evolution of the original game, would evolve into a full sequel. And it's disappointing that Vertigo 2 went the direction of emulating Half-Life Alyx rather than building on what made Remastered excellent. Vertigo 2 is still very good. It's stunningly good. It overflows with new and totally unexpected enemy types, bosses, and weapons. Its ridiculous humor returns, but is paired with a sincere cosmic awe and a legitimately sinister villain. The environments are lush, variable, and constantly surprising. There's even a short section ripped straight from Portal, which is a lot of fun. The first Vertigo has a relatively straightforward story. Sonja nearly escapes Plank's facility before Gentle Hand, another trapped alien, casts her back into the facility's depths, claiming orbital lasers will destroy the facility and everything in it, lest any alien escapes. The ending itself takes us away from Sonja's point of view and has us witness her ragdoll fall, making a mess on the way down. Yet another great display of Vertigo's sense of humor and creativity. Vertigo 2 adds complexity to the narrative with multiple characters with differing goals, all woven together into a big interdimensional drama. Sonja makes a lot of enemies during her adventure, culminating in one particularly great scene where she's captured by a group of disgruntled enemies, the game laying the "are we the bad guys" down pretty thickly, right before they are killed off by the first boss of the original game, assumingly returning for revenge, who is then killed off by an even bigger fish. My problems with Vertigo 2 can be summed up with a few broad points. While my first playthrough ended at around 12 hours, Vertigo 2 still feels too long. Combat has a tendency to drag on. There always seems to be more enemies than necessary during combat, and boss fights are similarly elongated. Perhaps most importantly, rather than building on what Vertigo established itself as between the original and remastered, Vertigo 2 restructures itself in the style of Half-Life Alyx. This means dual-wielding is no longer a thing, and teleportation becomes less of a tool and more of a primary mode of locomotion. Vertigo's unique wormhole effect for teleportation is replaced with a much more generic dash-like teleportation. Sonja's movement speed feels slightly slower than her fully upgraded speed in Remastered, though that is difficult to judge, and Vertigo 2 introduces enemies that are more accurate and fire faster shots, making the bobbing and weaving of Remastered a less effective strategy. Teleportation standing in for sprint and jump is not a style I've ever really been fond of. It doesn't feel good to play. Sprinting, especially while shooting, is energetic and fun. Teleportation in place of sprinting is piecemeal and disconnected, a constant start and stop that breaks the fluidity and flow of action. Alyx builds itself around a different context. It's accessible, slow, and combat is relatively confined and short-lived. In this regard, I think Alyx may have overcompensated, but that's a discussion for a different video. While it takes ideas from Alyx, Vertigo 2 pushes much further with its design. There are plenty of instances where you're flung through the air or fall from heights. You hit rocky waves in a boat and fire at enemy aircraft while flying. These scenes are really cool, but they're made of prime motion sickness material. So emulating Alyx's structure feels awkward and limiting because how you move doesn't match the intensity of Vertigo 2's levels. Teleporting through environments and during combat is just not as satisfying as standard locomotion. There's a loss of kinetic energy that's difficult to make up for. As with Alyx, while I play Vertigo 2, my brain constantly wants to sprint, if not at least somehow run faster. It's an itch I can't scratch. It cannot be overstressed how off the charts Vertigo 2's creativity is. It takes a much bigger bite and handles it well. But in this more complex space, a few smaller problems surface that I think may be indicative of the general adolescence and challenges of VR game development. Weapons now need to be reloaded, and the feel of the reload actions themselves is mostly fine. Slapping a new mag into the trident never gets old. Rather than needing to find ammo, ammo is based on a timer. Depending on the weapons and situation, it's possible and likely you'll cycle through each of a weapon's magazines and are forced to switch weapons while the previous weapon's mags recharge. It's a halfway solution I really like. You still have to be careful with ammo for powerful weapons, but you don't need to take the time to scrounge around and search for ammo, which I assume made the development process easier as well. It's not perfectly balanced. There are some weapons that are far more useful than others, and I do love myself some VR scrounging, but I don't mind the mechanic itself. Health only automatically replenishes up to 50% if you're below 50%, so searching for and picking up health vials provides some of that experience. While most reloading actions are fine, one exception is the shotgun, one of of the weapons I use the most. To reload the shotgun, you have to insert ammo at the top, but Sonja's hand stays there for a second before the magazine enters the gun itself. This makes for a constant, unbalanced feel to reloading the shotgun, because leaving my physical hand floating in midair as I reload is unintuitive, and if I lower my physical hand, Sonja's virtual hand briefly stays there. In a vacuum, this animation is not a big deal, but when it's something you encounter each time you reload the shotgun, which could be hundreds of instances over a dozen hours, it becomes grating. Also, like in Alyx, Vertigo 2 puts Sonja's flashlight on the back of her offhand, the idea being that when you grip a weapon with both hands, the light will shine forward. Problem is, doing this creates odd shadow effects, which I assume is a bug, but more than that, Alyx putting the flashlight on the back of Alyx's hand I never thought was an intuitive or comfortable spot for a flashlight in the first place. I'm not a game developer, so I'm not going to pretend that these solutions are easy, but it seems to me that the flashlight being attached to the front of weapons or on the side of Sonja's head is a more convenient and comfortable option than on the back of her hand. I resorted to just squirreling it up and pointing my weapon and flashlight separately, which isn't very comfortable but makes it easier to see. Perhaps the biggest problem with Vertigo 2 is its prolonged combat and numerous enemy counts. It's not that Vertigo 2's combat is bad, rather there seems to be an emphasis on prolonging firefights, whether by the number of enemies or how many waves of enemies you have to defeat before you're able to progress. This peaks toward the very end during a final battle of sorts, when you need to press 4 buttons to open a door but are forced to battle through groups of enemies you've already fought over the last few hours. It's redundant. Boss fights, at least in some instances, similarly go on too long. They are undoubtedly visually spectacular, and most of the fights themselves are phenomenal. They're just overextended. The biggest culprit is Maharashi Granto, a robotic cult leader that uses all sorts of magical attacks and spawns additional enemies to hunt you down. It's an intense fight, and one in which you're forced to constantly move. Some of Granto's attacks go through walls, and a few enemies, like these little spider bots, will run to your location and follow you until you kill them. To defeat Granto, you have to shoot him in the head, ripping the fabric away from his turban. As the battle goes on, the attacks get more intense and frequent, and once he's on his final layer, the attacks become extremely persistent. Granto is a difficulty spike born from an awkward design and the tendency to spawn way too many enemies. Right as the fight begins, you can focus your fire on Granto's head to rapidly take his health down, and it almost feels like the last few sections of Granto's health are there to compensate for this strategy. The principles that make Vertigo and Vertigo Remastered good are not necessarily new, but what they do is done extremely well, and what's created is a relatively unique VR shooter. While Vertigo 2 packs enough secrets into its 12-ish hour runtime that I was surprised how much stuff I missed during my first playthrough. But where Remastered gets almost everything right, Vertigo 2 is a bit of a paradox. The creativity never stops. The visuals and set pieces are some of the best I've ever seen in VR, but there's also a strange insistence on combat lasting longer than it needs to. Vertigo 2's scale, wonder, and creativity not only surpass the previous Vertigos, but also a lot of other VR games. While it emulates Alyx, I'd even go so far as to say that Vertigo 2 may actually be the better game. In some ways, Vertigo 2 is legitimately unlike any other VR shooter. In other ways, Vertigo 2 holds itself back. Its level design, personality, and tone are brilliant, but the foundation it builds itself on is not as fluid or enjoyable as Remastered.